Welcome to this session focused on the creative bureaucracy and its implications for the future of cities. I'm Andrew Carter, Chief Executive of the Centre for Cities, and my guest to explore these issues is Charles Landry. Welcome, Charles.
Hello, Andrew.
Everybody will know Charles is an international authority on the future of cities. And the creative use of culture in urban revitalisation. His book, The Creative City, a toolkit for urban innovators, became a movement to rethink the planning, development and management of cities. And that's one of the issues that we're going to explore during this session. Charles has worked with cities, national governments, civic institutions, private enterprises in more than 65 countries around the globe. So, Charles, let's start with this idea that you're very closely associated with the creative city. You've been writing about it, you've been thinking about it for many decades. How has your thinking evolved in relation to that issue? And then bring us right up to date in terms of the pandemic, and where does that leave us?
Well, that's a great question. Initially, when I thought of the idea quite a while back, oh my God, yes. And one of the things I said at the moment, at the beginning, I just said, the creative city is a clarion call to thinking differently. And what I said in one sentence, perhaps later in a fat book, was in a world of dramatic change, when business as usual perhaps doesn't work, we need to create the conditions to think, plan and act with imagination in solving problems and creating opportunities. Now, I think that in general still holds. However, in the beginning, of course, at that time, you remember back 30 years ago, people were really saying, who am I? Where am I? What is my city? What's my identity? And then the question of art and culture was a significant thing, as you know, many cities were restructuring all across the world. And that was valid. The only issue about that was as if that was the only thing that creativity implied, because of course we all know there's social innovations, there's business creativity, and so on. So over time, I've tried to emphasize that there's this broader holistic approach, and that the city, of course, is, I don't know, an ecosystem or a massive organism and so on. And one thing over time I really felt was missing, if you're looking at the city as a totality, was the public administration, because practically everything you do in one way or another has something to do with rules and incentives and what that regime is, even, you know, how the traffic lights work. That's a trivial example, but obviously many more. So I was, in fact, of course, had to rethink, as we all had to do in this moment that I'm not going to name, or I will name, the pandemic. And I explored to myself whether this still holds true. And I think that core sentence that I tried to express at the beginning still is true and shows itself to be really important. Whether the word, of course, creativity has been completely overused, and I promise I'll never use it again. And it's been associated with just being hip and all of these things, which from my perspective is not true. And I think what we've seen in the COVID moment is that people had to, through the shock, rethink. Where do we go? Often the impossible became possible. Often people had to do things at speed. The digital turn, the digital pivot shifted things. So there's a vast range of areas where using imaginative responses is more relevant than ever. That's my opinion as I see it today.
And that brings us in, well, when we'll come on to it in a moment, around your thinking around the creative bureaucracy, which we'll come back to. But I want to hold on, just carry on investigating this issue around creativity. You mentioned, in a sense, the word has been overused and in some respects not become meaningless, but actually becomes meaning to everything. Why is that? I mean, you know, you were writing about these issues back, 30 or so years ago and starting to think about them. You've seen the evolution of that term and how it's been used inappropriately, as you say, in some instances. What's your reflection on that?
Well, I mean, some people accuse me of, being a gentrifier and all these things. All you did is just try to get people to raise prices in cities. And as you well know, when you develop a term, sometimes a term catches on. And I think what we're trying to do, cities are complex things. You're always trying to encapsulate something in a phrase. Now, unfortunately, through time and, the vast social media activities that go on, people use words, eat them up, digest them, spit them out, the green city, the knowledge city, the intelligent city, the smart city, and all of these words. And that's why most recently I'm trying to express things in words you can't just digest and take and throw away. And that's important. That's why I'm always trying to say, what is the core, what we're trying to do? And the core is always in a city. What is the city? What makes a good city? How do you deal with wicked, complex problems? How do you give yourself the space? And this is what I largely mean by creativity, is to give yourself the moment and the space to stand back and say, does this work? Does the tried and tested work? Can we think afresh? Now, it does not mean that everything has to be thrown up in the air and we always say, hey, it's all got to be creative, blah-de-blah-de-blah. No, it's just trying to give yourself that moment. Some things will stay the same, but at least give yourself the opportunity to reassess and rethink.
And you touched on the impact of the pandemic. I mean, we're having this conversation whilst countries and cities across the globe are grappling with the realities of the pandemic and how it's playing out in their places. And we've seen this sort of very quick emergence of media often, but also commentators. This is the time, the end of the city is nigh. The very notion, the very reason why cities are successful, vibrant, creative, interconnectivity, density, proximity, all the things that you've written about over the decades. In a sense, they become problems now rather than opportunities. I mean, just where are you on, in your interaction with and reflection on the nature of the debate as we see it, in October 2020?
Well, clearly the city is changing and will change. There's obviously social distancing, all the things that everybody knows about, and it allows us to rethink, what do you do with offices? Do you put student homes in them? Do you shift all of the uses around and so on? But I think what's happened, and this is partly to do with digitization, and the digital turn, the digital pivot, has effectively in this moment fast-forwarded us as if it were already 2025. There were many developments often happening, and many people 6-7 months ago wouldn't go on a webinar or something like that, but now we're all webinaring and Zooming and all of these things. And what that has done, which was already being slowly pre-configured, because many cities, if we're looking at it globally, were becoming quite dysfunctional. And I think what that digital moment has done, it's reconfigured space, place and time. Now, these words are very easy to say, and one has to sort of slow down and say, space, yes, I can be here, there simultaneously. Place, I can locate myself 100 miles away and still connect quite well, and so on. So I think what's happening in the geography of cities is we obviously have to look at it more regionally, because it's giving an opportunity for smaller places to become perhaps more lively, and we'll come back to what liveliness might mean and vibrancy might mean. And if you are working at home more, and that already was happening, 8% of people were working from home already prior to the pandemic. If you only have to go into the office 3 days a week, 2 days a week, 1 day a week, your geography and your mental landscape widens. If you then say, okay, it's only 1 day a week, okay, I'll come in by train from 150 kilometers away. And so that's partly dealing with that. Now, the key question is the issues you've raised about density and proximity. The proximity or the vibe, the atmosphere, this is what I think you're talking about, these smaller places perhaps don't have that atmosphere. Perhaps they're even suburban. And I think some of the people who are the creators of that vibrancy, and that could be not necessarily an artist, but it could be just simply a cafe owner, a person who has an incubation center. I can already see signs of people replicating that or trying to replicate that in these other places. Now, the question is then, is that hollowing out the big city? My sense is it won't hollow it out, but there might be less density or something like that. And then we have to begin to ask a question about how much density is good. Because some of the density we had that was evolving, particularly if you look at nightlife and stuff like that, was possibly too much. And you can ask yourself the question, is actually a meeting with 13 people, 15 people of a better quality than being in a crowd of 100 people who I don't really talk to and so on? So these are interesting reflections one can have and obviously respond to.
And given your kind of global perspective, do you see these conversations or this thinking? Does it vary by if we go to the North America, or if we go to Europe, or if we go to Asia? Do you see differences in the way that they've been thinking about the cities and what they need from them, almost before the pandemic hit, but certainly through the pandemic as well? Do you see sort of global trends or regional trends in a bigger sense?
Well, I think there are some very big movements, like, for example, the shift in the phrase urban planning to placemaking. I'm just using that as a one example.
Yeah.
So that notion, or the higher prioritization of urban design as distinct from a piece of architecture. Of course, there are people who want to be a star architect and all of that. But all of those things reflect a widening of perspective of what is successful. So people are thinking about the hardware and the software, and also obviously the orgware, if you want to use that computer language. So there's a series of things I think you can see through all continents. However, it expresses itself clearly differently. If you take the Middle East, the notion of privacy, who is in the public space and all of that, is clearly different from a place like China, Hong Kong, and so on, where the density is incredibly intense and so on, whereas clearly these things in the States, which we all know that it's more spread out and stuff like that. And so those moments have to be more created, and they create also difficulties, because much of what is possible in Asia is very much to do with, quick movements of transport. I mean, the transport system in Hong Kong is absolutely amazing, plus the diversity of it, which is very difficult to replicate in the same way in American cities, where everything seems to be a destination that you have to decide to go to. There's less, I feel, apart from the wonderful hubs in the States, of that easy serendipitous meeting and chance encounter. When we look at Africa, of course, the informality of Africa sets us, not a challenge, but asks us to ask ourselves, is every type of city the same? That informal city has a different sort of vibrancy and obviously economic basis. I personally feel there's something great about European cities, and that's perhaps because I'm European. But what's good about European cities is that sense of the centre being, historically at least, a neutral territory where the different elements of the city came together. And some of the Enlightenment values that Europe had, I know Europe imperialized the world and that's very bad, but some of the qualities of that had something which was really rather good, which is this notion of the public interest, the common interest. How does the individual relate to the group? And quite clearly, and I don't want to get into philosophy, we know that obviously in Asia, group thinking is stronger than individualized thinking. The States is the opposite. And that's why I think it's quite interesting to interrogate what these differences are, just like the question you're asking me.
Yeah. No, that's a fantastic point. Urbanization is a common process, but the process itself and the outcomes are hugely variated across space and across time, aren't they? Which I think is amazing.
Yeah.
So one of the other issues, I think, which is sometimes associated with creativity and the sort of the re-emergence of cities, I suppose, in North America and in Europe over the last 30-odd years. People, if we're in London today, people forget that actually the population of London was declining pretty much from the 1930s all the way through until the 1980s, and it's only relatively recently we've seen a resurgence, and that tells us something about the nature of urban change. But this idea that you see in maybe in North America, particularly in parts of Europe, this winner-takes-all sort of model of urbanism. London dominates. Half a dozen places in the US dominate. Cities dominate. Their hinterlands. Just your thoughts on that? A degree of inevitability about that, or does that tell us something about how we should think and remodel the way we think about cities?
That certainly is the dynamic. If you look globally, you could probably say, if we say tier one, there are probably 5 or 6 cities that dominate that, and we know who they are: New York, London, Tokyo, Beijing, Shanghai, and so on. And then there's another level which you could incorporate into that, which is a bit below. But you could probably say there are 25 cities, very big cities in the world, that have that suction effect. I've written about it, calling it the Vortex Effect, where the maelstrom sucks everything in. That dynamic has certainly taken place and has led, as you say, to the rise of certain cities. I mean, as we know, New York nearly went bankrupt in the 80s, and then suddenly people realized, well, there are all these facilities, these infrastructures that have values, and they reassessed them, and that's was partly at the pull. And it was also, obviously, as you well know, to do with strategic decision-making. You could only, if you were ambitious, really make your way in those cities. And I think these core cities will still be central nodal points. But I think it will often be in relation to other cities. I mean, just take the UK, you could say, and Bristol, which will have some sort of energy and so on. So I think there will be that still. I think it will loosen up. And I think people, because of this thing about face-to-face or needing to be there, you can still be either cool, not necessarily the most important thing in the world, either successful, relatively important, ambitious, reasonably important, also not being always in the central hub. But I still think the hub, the maelstrom effect, will still exist. But I think it will be weaker.
Yeah, no.
Because it's always, historically, there were a few cities where political, economic, and cultural agendas were really set in all sorts of ways. And those were those core cities you're saying. And I think we have to just wait and see if second types of cities come in. I mean, I'll just mention a couple that are being seen as a gleam in people's eyes. Just taking Europe as an example, you could say Copenhagen, the green thing. You could say Amsterdam, incredible history of innovation. You could say Berlin, which is a sort of anchor point in Central Europe and so on. So I think there'll be a slight readjustment in the urban global hierarchies.
Yeah, no, that's a very good point. As you say, the shift in sands and the positioning of cities over time relative to themselves, their hinterlands, but actually other cities, often in other parts of the globe, I think is an enduring trait. Let's move to this notion of creative bureaucracy. You said this was the last time you're going to use the word creative, but you notice it's in there. And creative and bureaucracy, oxymoron, can you put those two things together? But just unpack that a little bit about, what you mean by creative bureaucracy, and then we can get into how that interacts with cities as places of innovation and dynamism and vibrancy and creativity.
Well, I'd said before that I like to, and I think many others too, see the city as a complex ecosystem where everything interconnects and interrelates. So the oxymoron is obviously on purpose, because you could have said, oh, these bureaucrats are so bloody crappy, they don't do anything, and it's all red tape and all of that. You could do that and then say, there is this initiative called innovation in cities, and be bloody innovative. Now, I'm not sure psychologically that's the best way to engender change. Now, bearing in mind that people who work in the public sector, which includes teachers at one end and lots of other people, is millions and millions and millions. It's possibly the biggest sector in the world. So putting them together, creativity still sounds a bit, okay, that's quite interesting. Bureaucracy sounds wooden, dead, lifeless, and eviscerated. And so I've tried to recapture that word as okay, because in different languages and different cultures, the word bureaucracy doesn't sound quite as bad as it does in the English language. And I'm trying to signal to the public administrator, yes, you have imagination too. You can do things. And indeed, you are doing things. And the reason I came to that was just like you and many of us here, we relate to public servants all the time, and they're not all stupid. Of course they're not. They're obviously often very educated. Of course there are pen pushers. There are pen pushers in the private sector too. And the point was really to say, if you look at a helicopter view, you can see all sorts of innovations happening. But public servants are normally not credited, you don't know their names and so on. So one element is to highlight the thousands and thousands of unsung heroes. So I would say that was the inspiration. The other inspiration, of course, was politically in our country, people just basically, spoke negatively about all those public institutions. So my view is, okay, the public interest, the common interest is incredibly important to make great places. The creative bureaucracy, in simplistic terms, if we're sloganizing, has three slogans. Well, I'll mention three just for the sake of this conversation. One is, how do you move from a no because to a yes if culture? A second slogan could be to be strategically principled and tactically flexible, which basically means there's some things we hold very dear today, climate issues, let's say, or whatever. You really, really mean it. But how you get there will change through circumstance. So you're shifting the planning model from a predict and provide one to one where you try to plan in a flexible way for the unknown. The third slogan you could mention in terms of this thing would be to say, keep the best and reinvent the rest. Now, the creative bureaucracy has, in my view, then three pillars. One, how do you create incentives and regulations that are good, relevant, and helpful for our times? Pillar one. Two, a very important pillar, how do you deal with the inner life of public administrations, where many people want to give more but can't because of the system? And we did a global survey of creativity in public administrations and found two things I'll just mention here as highlights. One, the difference between what people thought they could offer and what they felt the institution allowed them to offer. That was one main point. The second, so people thought they could give more if the conditions were right. The second point was that people highlighted the most important thing was to do with flexibility. Now, flexibility, obviously home working is one element, but there are many forms of flexibilities that were highlighted. 80% said that was their key thing. That implies moving away a bit from hierarchies, transdisciplinary working, all the things about breaking down silos. The problem is one that our collective intelligence can address. And so systems need to have embedded that flexibility, all of which is easy to say and slightly difficult to do. So these are the sort of key elements that I've been trying to promote and to revalue that public administrator. And it's quite ironic, I've only worked in an institution like that once when I was a young guy at the EU and once when I worked for a year at the World Bank. So I'm perhaps the worst person to discuss this. But anyway, I do love my bureaucrats.
No, well, quite. And I think somebody has to. I mean, two thoughts on that, get your reflections on both. I mean, it seems to me that part there, that's a broader and bigger agenda about rethinking this kind of fairly unsophisticated idea that, private good, public bad. We've had this sort of a philosophy in some respects, in the way that the public sector is organized, in a sense, needs to be minimized and activity needs to be outsourced or, given to the private sector to deliver and organize. And I think, that you can begins to see a pushback in terms of that. And maybe in some instances, we've definitely reached the kind of limits of that sort of model. So your reflections and, that broader set of issues. And then related to that, it seems to me also that this is a story about and a reminder that institutions are incredibly important to life, in a sense, whether it's on the economic side or on the social side. And maybe, again, we've denuded some of our very important institutions over a period. We know we've not given them the due regard and credibility that they need in order to help us live the lives that we want to live. But I don't know, am I reading too much into that? It seems to be where where you are in terms of your thinking on both of those issues.
Yes, I mean, I think the basic spur, just to summarise it in one simple sentence, is clearly there is much that needs to be done within public administration. And particularly, it's beyond purely digitising. Digitisation is obviously a game changer in many, many ways. But the sort of changes we're talking about are actually cultural changes. And we all know that cultural change is the one that takes longest to shift. And I think the trajectory that you highlighted a minute ago, let's think Max Weber here, he died exactly 100 years ago, more or less today. We're having an important discussion in an important moment. But if we take that trajectory forward, clearly new public management agenda and all of that, and that began to be challenged and has been challenged with lots of things enabled, of course, by the feedback loops, enabled by social media and so on, and rethinking how you open out systems, open source, all of these things, which all imply different organizational forms, but also different ways of consulting with people, consulting more than consulting, ultimately, perhaps, ideally, co-creating, co-designing. And these shifts have been quite significant, because when you look at things from an age perspective as well, you're really getting a problem, because the Creative Bureaucracy Festival, which we just completed last week, one of the key messages about that, leaving aside that 48% of the 15,000 unique visitors were under 34, is they just won't accept certain ways of behaving. That doesn't mean they haven't got all the good things in their mind and in their heart. So there is a shift, and again, keep the best, reinvent the rest. Clearly, public-private partnerships or the reinvention of those have value in them, but it's the framing. Who is the framer? What is the ethical frame within which the energy of the private sector is expressed? And that's really what it's about again, because cities are about us all, somehow, in all our complexity, being together. So there needs to be some ethical frame from my perspective. So that is one thing I wanted to mention. The other thing about institutionalization, that's a really interesting and actually slightly difficult question, because, again, taking the helicopter view, there are an incredible amount of interesting initiatives going across the world, and I'm sure this event, the World Cities event, is going to describe some of them. Now, how do we bring these fragments together? Are they just going to be little bursts of an event which is relatively interesting or not, and suddenly flips away? How do you institutionalize these things is the key question. But the form of institutionalization and the default positions that I believe need to be ideally embedded in the new institutions have to be something like we said before, transdisciplinary working is the norm, even though we respect the specialist. I mean, classically, I'm giving you a trivial example, if you don't mind. If you classically take a street, I remember in Australia, I was working in Adelaide, and then there were different disciplines, and they were working in a multidisciplinary way. So the environmental said, this is necessary. The road people said, this is necessary. The science said, this is necessary. So they were making this street, and the whole result was a bit of a spaghetti, which was completely uncomfortable. If you flip it around and say, what makes a great street, and what could your knowledge contribute to that great street, you find that you have a completely different conversation. And the streets that come up are usually better. And this is quite interesting that Vinnova, as you probably know, the Swedish Innovation Agency, has a major project precisely on this. That's where they're putting one of their major resources into rethinking streets, which is then seen more holistically. The transport planner isn't in charge, they're part of a team and so on. And that's the shift that one wants to normalise. And of course it's happening in parts, but there is still resistance, obviously.
Yeah, no, and to pick up that and get your thoughts on this, because I think this is a kind of interesting point around, one of the ways undoubtedly that we can evolve and develop this thinking is through experimentation, lots of different places, some, cities, but not only cities, trying new things out, learning from what they're doing and amending their own practices. And then obviously other cities learning from those cities themselves, or at least trying to understand what they were trying to do, and then incorporating and interpreting that makes sense to them. So say something about, the importance of experimentation in that process, firstly, and then you touched on it. How do we learn effectively from each other? As you say, going to a conference, listening to that inspiring speaker who talks about the inspiring place, that's off, or reading the book and which got a chapter on X or a chapter on Y. We've all done these sorts of things and they're all useful in their own way, but you do come away, somewhat sort of dissatisfied. So experimentation, and then how do we learn? Yeah,
they're both two great questions. I mean, the experimentation thing is partly also legitimizing it. And when one of the things about the creative bureaucracy that perhaps I haven't focused on enough is really the relationship between the politician and the public administrator. Because if you have a horrible politician, you're going against the headwind all the time.
Yes.
So when you look at overarching themes and threads of innovation, you usually find there's some sort of leadership, either person or grouping, that is creating an enabling environment, allowing there to be a yes in environment. The problem, though, as you know much better than me, is issues around budgeting. Everything sort of, I was about to say some phrase I don't want to say, but it really gets down to it when you're having the budget discussion.
Yes. Yep.
So you might want to say education and economics and so should connect. But then everybody is defensive because the budget is locked in already to departments. And this is where some real nitty-gritty work needs to be done, which is either liberating budgets outside of the particular departments, that's one way of doing it, or creating incentives that when you liberate, then you can get extra resources. And often that's when you get into different levels of government, that a local, regional, or a national government might have that view, and you get the prize for actually acting in that new way. So yes, there is a developing ecosystem of experimentation. You know about it, living labs. Oh, I think there are 300 or 400 already. Perhaps we're overlapping, I don't know. But these are the units within.
Yes.
Then you sometimes have national innovation agencies, like one of the first was Mind Lab in Denmark, and so on. And there are quite a few now over the world. So you've got various elements. The UK policy unit was trying to do interesting things and did do interesting things. So all of these things are sort of there as elements. Now the question is, how do you keep that agenda through time, and also keep in mind that point I tried to make earlier, that again, innovation is another word that's overused, because sometimes we perhaps don't need to innovate. Perhaps sometimes we need to look back. When we say about, great vibrant cities, we analyse it more carefully and we find it's the template that might have existed in 19th century Paris or something like that. And you're actually recovering the past. But basically, it needs to be legitimised. You need to have, perhaps, within, and this is really the nitty-gritty, because everything is about nitty-gritty in the end. There's one thing sort of generalising, another is, what are you going to do today or tomorrow? And so one of the main triggers is in recruitment. Recruitment is incredibly important. What are the criteria within which you recruit? Also, what are the evaluations you do on the yearly or whatever evaluations you have? And are these qualities that we're talking about ones that are legitimised? And that raises a question. What are the qualities and characteristics of the future bureaucrat or future public administrator. And I think they need to have different qualities. Leaving aside the specialisms, we know from all sorts of other things in the private sector as well that issues like communication, the capacity to mediate, these are all incredibly important qualities, the capacity to connect across disciplines and so on. So that's a bit of that landscape. Now, the question of learning, I've been asking myself that question for so many years, and I don't know really the main answer. I mean, obviously, learners, I think we need to make the distinction between learners and the learned. I mean, too often, the people who are talking to you or at you are learned, and you're not sure if you're learning.
No, quite.
Because of their approach.
Yes.
But quite clearly, we once did a survey of Swedish librarians, this was a while back, and to work out how they learned and what was the most effective way. And we did things, do you learn through the internet, reading books, meeting friends and stuff like that, and so on. And funnily enough, not surprisingly, the two most transformative moments for people were, one was much more the conversation, the direct conversation with the person who'd done something, i.e. direct, face-to-face, so you had that visceral connection, and therefore being able to ask all these nitty-gritty questions. But the other was going to the place that you had admired and then really seeing that. So clearly that's not always easy today, for example, and so you have all these other mechanisms, networks and stuff like that, which are useful. But I'm interested, and I think we all are interested when you're learning, in that insight, that transformative moment. And I think, leaving aside actually seeing it, it's the person who's done it. We in our festival, we had something about effectively Kate Raworth's donut economics. We didn't put Kate Raworth in. We put the bureaucrat, a rather wonderful woman who'd been there for 30 years, who is doing 200 projects, not doing herself, but managing 200 projects, actually trying to implement it. And her work, I think, was incredibly powerful with all the people she connected with. And also for our audience, we got feedback that her contribution was particularly valuable because they could ground a general idea. I do think, of course, that concepts are important, and I really believe in concepts, but you always have to then bring the concept down so it becomes not only visual, but becomes experiential for the person, which comes back to storytelling. I'll give you an example. One of our sessions was connected with the Global Resilient Cities Network, which you know of. And we had these examples from Paris, where they'd done surveys of 30, institution had done 30 cities, what they'd done. And then there was another one from North Ayrshire. And he was saying, we've got a well-being strategy and we're doing this and it's all going to be resilient. And I kept on thinking, why don't you just tell me that after 3 months, because of your strategy, 50 people went vegan and they saved 30,000 litres of water. That would have got me to understand the importance of what you're doing. So it's always feet on the ground. You might have head in the sky, but feet on the ground.
Well, no, quite. And that's, as you know better than most, in a sense, you can't go to a city or read about a city without reading about its ambition and its vision to be X or Y. And I'm always struck by how similar they are on the first instance, and secondly, how meaningless they are in another respect, in the sense they are so vague and abstract that they tell us very little about actually how they're going to do that. And more particularly, some of the hard choices that they're going to need to make in terms of it's this rather than that. We need to trade off this rather than the other. And I think more of that conversation, and more of that realism, I think, is going to be needed if we're really going to get under the skin of these sorts of issues.
Yes, absolutely. I mean, one of the things that strikes me as you're talking is that one of the currencies, which we know is a currency, is, of course, is the relation, is trust. So that trust thing is obviously internally in the organisation, then with other organisations and so on. So if we just take public, private, civic, is developing some language that can then develop trust, which then creates the preconditions to then perhaps begin to make choices which are publicly expressed so people understand that they're very difficult choices. I mean, I remember, I think a couple of Brazilian cities, I'm not sure it was Porto Alegre or something, said, look, we've got a budget of X million. We want this, that costs 15 million. Okay, we're going to have to make choices. And
Yes.
I think that sort of putting it into figures is really positive.
And one of the other issues I wanted to pick up with you in that sort of area is around power, I suppose, and particularly governmental power. This is a particular issue in the UK, as you know, but it applies to other places. And actually, I think in some respects, the pandemic has shone a light on this question, which is, who holds the power in the first instance, and who is holding it, but actually who is best placed to make the decisions and deliver the actions that are required. And I think the pandemic has revealed to us or reminded us again in the UK that we are very centralised as a country, political power held very strongly by the centre. And our cities and our local authorities, municipalities are relatively weak compared to the centre. And that causes a whole bunch of problems. So just say something more about how that power differential issue plays out through the creative bureaucracy.
Well, the key issue you're addressing there is national governments mostly have the authority to generate the rules and regulations regimes. Cities have more legitimacy, mostly, to implement the changes that they think really matter. And so that difference between authority and legitimacy is really important. And that battle is a global battle that is going on. I mean, obviously, in some countries, cities have zero power, and you just bang, I'm appointing the mayor, and off you go.
Yes.
But let's just assume there's a sort of a system we recognise. And one of the things, I happen to be on the advisory committee of it, is the Global Parliament of Mayors, which is obviously inspired initially by Ben Barber's book, If Mayors Ruled the World. And that had so many important messages in it. If there's garbage on the street and you're a mayor or a leadership group, you better get rid of it.
You better collect it.
You better deal with it. And I think by infantilizing cities, which some countries do, they are wasting unbelievable resources, because the resource lies in the collective intelligence, the collective will to perhaps be motivated to do something. Now, if I'm infantilized, of course, psychologically, I retreat in some way and you get less done. So governments who think they've got the truth in that sense are basically being naive. But power, of course, people don't like giving up power. What they should do is say to themselves, and we used to give a prize for this, by the way, they should trade their power for creative influence. If they loosened up, they would achieve more collectively, because they could say the group of cities in the UK, as an example, are achieving so much, and a bit of the blessing comes back to them. This problem will not go away. And there needs to be a new, and it's not a formal contract, I'm just using the word contract, a new relationship of mutual respect and understanding of what each party offers. And that then leads us to another conversation, because also the relationships between cities themselves in a country, which again can be sometimes unhelpfully over-competitive.
Yes.
Whereby when we're looking at resources, if you had that more open situation, you would see different roles for different cities. So this problem that you're addressing layers itself right down.
Yes, no, quite. As we begin to come to a close on this session, you recently held an exhibition of your life's work in Sicily, which
yes.
Great, a fantastic location, by the way, a great choice. So top marks for the place of where you did the exhibition. But I mean, what were you looking to do there through the exhibition? And I suppose, what do you take away from organising it? I mean, where does that leave you? To almost to kind of think back through the decades of doing this work.
Yeah, I mean, it was really an incredible incredibly helpful moment for me to have to do that process you're just thinking about. And I had a great curator, Turin guy, who helped me. And he got me in one because I obsessively, I've got so many photos of which 99.9% are crap. I'm always trying to do visual stories. And what we decided to do was everything, not pretending to be the master photographer, just did everything on posters. And what we did in this place called Favara, which is amazing, another story, another time, throughout this place that was being regenerated, we had all these posters going through the town and also asking always questions, and people kept on writing on the things, and the questions were always a bit provocative and stuff like that. And what it did, it allowed me to try and rethink back all the conversations, perhaps a couple of thousand one might have had in one's life about what makes great places. And then I thought about it. It was going to come out in March, and it came out in September. And then I had to ask myself, are these things still true in a pandemic? And the 5 elements that I had, which I organised, what ultimately became 8 rooms, were the following, which I still think are true. I don't know if you do, which is great places for people from the point of view of the person is they want a place of anchorage and distinctiveness, a place that they know is theirs, that they know of, that is familiar. There has some elements of heritage which makes you feel a bit safe. You have a trajectory, a lineage, and so on. The distinctiveness, oh, this could only happen here type thing. So that's element 1. The second element was a place of connection and communication. That can be casual visitors, friends, deeper friends, and so on. But it's also all the infrastructure, trains, buses, cars, bikes, micromobility, and the ability to fly to X, Y, Z. So all of those things seem to be incredibly important for people, which link then to the third thing that people want. They want in a place, obviously, to become the best they can be, which is about the third theme, opportunity, ambition. So you've got energy. And particularly when you're thinking about generations, young and old and stuff like that, is this a place that provides that? Are the institutional setups such that it provides me pathways from learning to whatever else, and so on? The fourth, that is ever more important, was a place of nurture and nourishment. And what nurture and nourishment has always meant to me is both obviously the facilities, hospitals, parks, all of these things, retail and all of these things like that, but also generosity. When you walk in space and place, I think we all feel sometimes this is a generous place. It's giving me, it's saying yes to me. The public institution has given me a gift. And when you feel you've been given a gift, as people know, you're more likely to want to give back. So that nourishment and nurturing was the fourth. And the fifth was, not surprisingly, to do with inspiration and allowing the imagination. Now, inspiration historically could have been many things. It could have been the church, the mosque, the temple. It's different for different people. For others, museums were once called the cathedrals of the post-industrial age. So it could be that. But it could be that beautiful word in Spanish, sobremesa, when you gather together with friends and people you don't quite know, and you just feel you're merging into some collectivity. It could be that, which then allows you, because you feel relaxed, to sort of open your mind and so on. So I think these things are still true in a pandemic age.
No, well, I think they are completely true today, even more so than maybe they were in the past. And they're a wonderful set of reflections to finish on. Charles, it's been amazing and wonderfully rich conversation. Thank you very much for sharing your thoughts with us, Charles Landry.
Thank you for inviting me. Thank you very much.